As the recovery effort continues for both Hurricanes Helene and Milton, FEMA has come under fire after Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas claimed earlier this month that the federal agency does not have the funds to make it through the season. Last month, Congress allocated more than $20 billion, that's with a B, dollars to the agency for disaster relief. Now, FEMA's performance has become a campaign issue, with many questioning the agency's devoting $1.4 billion since 2022 to address the Biden-Harris administration's border crisis. Joining me now to discuss this is Chad Wolf. He was the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration and is now chairman for the Center of Homeland Security and Immigration at America First Policy Institute. Chad, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thanks for having me.
So you saw, before we jump into this, explain to our viewers and listeners FEMA and its role within the Department of Homeland Security, because as secretary, you had oversight. It was one of many agencies that you had oversight. Explain how that fits in.
Well, absolutely. So FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is one of 8 operating components inside the department. And of course, they're there to help address any type of natural disaster, right? That's hurricanes, it's flooding, it's wildfires, and a host of other things. Obviously, hurricanes and wildfires are the biggest ones that they address. And so when we had this, historic flooding that we see in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia mainly, as well as Hurricane Milton in Florida, obviously they're there to respond. They're there to help individuals, providing individual assistance, as well as providing debris clearing and other services that we need to restore either power or restore services back to those communities. So FEMA goes in there and helps and aids the local and state emergency managers to help do that at that local level.
Before I jump into the money issue, whether or not FEMA needs more money and where they've allocated money, let's talk about, has there become an over-reliance on the federal government when it comes to a natural disaster? I mean, these are huge natural disasters that have occurred, and there's a lot of criticism. I'm not quite sure it's all justified. But you've been there. You've overseen the response to these natural disasters. Is there too much of a reliance on the federal government?
Well, it's always been sort of a three-legged approach, right? Which is the federal government, state and local emergency managers. So that's either at the state level or the local town or city level. And then there's the private sector. So there's a number of groups, Samaritan's Purse, right, Team Rubicon, and others that help go into these disaster areas and provide services, some at the behest of the federal government, some on their own through private donations and the like. And so that's always been the case. Now, of course, when there's ever an incident or there's something wrong, obviously FEMA is there to take some of the criticism, and some of the criticism is very valid. Some is not as well. So I don't know about an over-reliance, but I think FEMA sometimes doesn't do a very good job of explaining exactly what their role to do. Historically, it's been there to provide assistance to the state and local emergency managers who know the area, that know that environment the best, and then they provide additional resources. And obviously what they can provide as far as individual assistance, that's getting individuals monetary assistance in their time of need. The federal government provides that, and of course FEMA provides that. So there's always been that balance of making sure that they're all working together. Now, the question becomes on FEMA is, are they using the resources in the right manner, and are they acting quick enough in times of disaster? Have they pre-positioned either individuals, officials, or supplies in the right area for that natural disaster? And are they cutting through that red tape quick enough so that people impacted by those disasters get that assistance as quickly as possible?
Now, from the members of Congress that I've spoken to in these districts, that pre-positioning of the assets was reportedly not there.
Well, look, I think that's right. I think if we talk about what occurred on Helene, I think most of that pre-positioning was in the state of Florida, right? That's where that hurricane made landfall. That's usually where you pre-position commodities and resources and people as well. And so what occurred in the hills and the mountains of North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee and elsewhere It's just a matter of them not planning on it, right? And so I think less prepositioning of information and prepositioning of supplies and elsewhere was done there. And I think that's why you see FEMA behind the ball when it comes to relief in those areas, because they weren't in that forward-looking position. And so we continue to see that. We continue to see them not moving as fast as I would like to see them move. And that's because they will say they've never experienced anything like this, that a hurricane moving inland that so far north and having that type of impact. And someone say it's a failure of imagination and forecasting to see that communities up there would be impacted the way in which they were.
Chad, one other thing that I've observed during your time as Secretary of Homeland Security, there was a very close relationship with the non-governmental organizations, especially the faith community, that is often on the front lines when these disasters occur. There is a crowding out that kind of takes place on the left. They want more government. There sometimes, anecdotally, stories I've gotten from these last two disasters is they're hostile to the non-governmental organizations. No, as you said, there's a three-legged approach to this, a three-legged stool. Without those faith-driven non-governmental organizations, it makes it very difficult to respond to these in a timely manner to people who are hurting.
Yeah, there's no doubt, particularly the NGOs, and a big part of that is, as you indicated, Tony, are those faith-based organizations. And so they're absolutely critical. I've heard some of the same anecdotes as you mentioned, which is criticism, which is government knows best, right? We're going to run this either through FEMA or through the North Carolina Emergency Management, and crowding out other organizations that can help, that have a history of helping. And maybe they don't exactly move them out of the way, but they're not embracing them in the way in which certainly we did during the Trump administration. So I think it's very, very important to bring those outside partners in, because they're an additive, right? They're doing things that FEMA can't do. And when FEMA's resources are spread so thin, as we see now across the state of Florida and elsewhere, some of these other groups are actually critical of getting in there and being those first responders, in a sense of helping those survivors navigate the situation that they now face. So yes, you actually need to embrace but I've heard anecdotally, as you said, that this administration is not been as welcoming to that.
Talk about resources. Congress, right before they left, adjourned, passed a continuing resolution with that $20 billion more for disaster relief. Now we have Secretary Mayorkas calling for Congress, the president calling for Congress to return to allocate more money. Is that premature until they've really assessed what the cost is going to be?
Well, it certainly was premature when he made that comment. If you recall, he made that comment before Hurricane Milton was even a hurricane, and certainly before it made landfall. So he was making those comments on the way down to North Carolina, right? So as the Secretary of Homeland Security, part of your job, along with the FEMA administrator and others in federal government, is to show those impacted that for the most part, the federal government hears you, and we're there to help you as best we can using the authorities that we have. And so one of the first things he says on the way down to North Carolina is we're out of money. FEMA doesn't have enough money, which I would say is the exact wrong message to send to the people that are hurting in North Carolina. They want to know that the government is on their side and is doing everything possible to make sure that they get the assistance they need in such devastating times. And second, to your point, I'm not sure it's accurate. They have access to over $20 billion to draw from. And so, the amount of money that they have obligated versus what they have actually spent, they've obligated a good amount. What they've actually spent is very low. So now is not the time to talk about we need to replenish what we call the disaster relief fund. Now is the time to help individuals on the ground, and then come back at the appropriate time to Congress to say, look, the DRF, the Disaster Relief Fund, is running low. We have more expenses. We know we're going to have more assistance that we need to provide, and now we need Congress to supplement that disaster relief fund. And Congress is there to do that. They've done that historically. There's little debate. The only debate is how much, right? There's always making sure that we take care of those impacted most. But to do that, just a week or so after the events unfold, I think was way premature, and it wasn't the right debate to be having at the time. I think that can be decided Probably after the election, frankly. I think there's more than enough funding to get them through that period of time, and then they can certainly come back after that.
Chad, to me, looking at that, it just further politicized the disaster relief effort, pointing the finger to Congress, saying we don't have the money to do the job. I think it was shifting focus away from FEMA, trying to put the eyes on Congress.
Well, that's a great point. And we see this, unfortunately, from this administration, right? When you look at the border and you look at the crisis we experience at the border, what's the one thing they can say is Congress hasn't passed a bill, right? So they kind of have a pattern here of shifting responsibility.
Chad Wolf, always great to see you. Thanks for taking time to join us today and give us a little insight into what's happening there at FEMA.
All right, thanks.